So Lance and Erica today are going to share some of the great work they've been doing, trying to answer the question of where are good locations for cooling centers to be? How do we think about that problem? And how do we put that question to use operationally, which is so quite a challenge. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this has become a pretty popular topic in a wide range of the academic literature. Lance has been working on this as part of his PhD work at ASU. And I know Lance has more to say on the problem framing, what he's been up to. So I think I've gone on long enough. Other than to reiterate, thanks again to Lance and Erica for being here. We're going to hear first from Lance and then from Erica. And I think we have lots of time for questions, and we have a polling activity at the end of our meeting today. So I'll get out of the way, and Lance, the stage is yours. Thanks so much for joining us from the road in particular.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks for everyone for having me. As Dave mentioned, I am on the road, so I'm currently doing this from a Starbucks. So hopefully the audio is, everybody can hear me good and everything's good there. We have a few slides here. Yeah, so what I'm largely going to focus on talking about is the kind of process we went through for identifying kind of potential locations for additional cooling centers, and kind of go through that process in of itself. And this all really branches off the work that myself, Heidi, Erica led, and all of us have kind of put together and published rather recently. And so this was a paper in the Journal of Community Science titled produced workflow for addressing inequities in cooling center access. So basically with this paper, we took this approach to try to identify where we might want to put additional cooling centers, largely using ArcGIS software. And then we applied it to the Phoenix area as well as the Tucson area. And really, we kind of have the paper standing up as kind of like a showcase of how you go through it. What are some differences in terms of considerations in terms of some of the parameters, things like that. Just considering the fact that Tucson and Phoenix are, both very hot locations, but have a different set of resources and needs and things like that. So overarching goal, right, is to just use the location allocation tool. That's the specific tool that we leverage in ArcGIS Pro through their network analysts to identify where additional cooling centers could be located. And the idea here is to try to locate additional cooling centers closer to populations that are vulnerable or at risk to extreme heat, and really be able to bring in additional data to help inform that as well. Another thing to mention about this optimization approach is it'll select, like it may identify where we want to put additional cooling centers, but it'll also do so in such a way that minimizes the distance individuals would have to travel to get to a cooling center. And so I'll speak a little bit more on that here in a second. But yeah, there's three main components to getting it going. The first is kind of going through the input data. I won't talk in a lot of detail about it, but my hope here is to give you guys like enough of kind of a high medium overview to understand like what data sets would we need if you all wanted to replicate this yourself. So yeah, so the first thing that we would need is the road network database. So this is largely just going to be the road network itself. There are some useful features to the road network database. But in addition to that, we also have our input points. So these will be the points representing our vulnerable populations, as well as points representing our existing cooling centers, and then the kind of candidate or universe of potential parcels that could serve as a cooling center. Then we'll jump to some of the parameters, and I'll kind of like highlight a few of the key ones and talk about it within the context of that paper we published as well. And yeah, then I'll hand it off to Erica. So, but before we do that, let me go ahead and jump into a little bit more about the input data. So this figure comes from our paper. And sorry, this figure comes from our paper, and it really just kind of outlines some of the differences with the input data between the Phoenix and Tucson area. In general, I mentioned that road network database. That's one that's not visually depicted on here. But I just wanted to mention too that the road network database really reflects the road characteristics. So when you're doing this like location modeling, you want to make sure that you have the road network well represented, but also represented in such a way where like one-way roads are included. Things that are one-way roads are included, certain paths like highways and stuff, if you're going to model this for walking behavior, could be excluded. That type of information you would set up in the road network database. And then the next part here are your candidate facilities. So candidate facilities are just the locations of parcels that could serve as a cooling center. So this is that universe of parcels that could serve as a potential cooling center that the optimization tool is actually going to look at and pick from in terms of trying to determine, if you want to add an additional 10 cooling centers, for example, it would select from that particular list. In the figure, you can kind of see here that the candidate facilities for Phoenix, obviously there's many more parcels than there were for the Tucson area, but it does give you kind of an idea of just the kind of scope in terms of the number of parcels, but then also some of the parcel types. With this portion of the paper, we kind of kept a pretty broad umbrella in terms of parcel types, because the way we really envision this is something that you all would be able to use, but it wouldn't be the final say, right? Like you get the output, you say, okay, maybe we can put a cooling center in this location, or maybe there's some other information that doesn't get incorporated in this process, and you say, okay, that one's not the best, but the one right next to it I think would work as well. So we really see this as kind of an iterative process as far as utilizing this for decision making. Demand points, all that means is, again, those are our target locations or the populations that are at risk to extreme heat that we really want to focus on here. In this process, they're represented by points. So typically these are parcel points. In the case of Phoenix, we also have points that represent individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So that kind of represents a different population that's obviously kind of focal point for this particular adaptation as well. When you're looking at this figure here for the paper, when we determined the demand locations, in addition to using the data on unsheltered homelessness, like I said before, we also did a sample in Phoenix of residential parcels. And then in Tucson, they were looking at both fixed foundation residential parcels and mobile home locations as well. And we were really focused in the kind of like the 25 most socially vulnerable census tracts. That's where we pulled that sample from. And then the final bit's existing locations. So that's just locations that are already cooling centers that we know we want to continue to serve as a cooling center. We want to look at kind of where we would put these new ones in the context of those existing centers. So that's another parameter that you would set up as well. Sorry, another input. So the next section is just kind of some of the key parameters. And there's a few things to mention here. Some of them, for example, and again, this also comes from our paper as well. Directionality. So when you're doing this location modeling, you basically just need to identify that are the demand points going to be going from their home to a cooling center? Like that's the behavior we want to try to model. So two facilities is just an option you set up there. With this approach, you can also include cutoff thresholds. So for example, if you don't want some demand points having to travel more than say a mile, that can be kind of a hard cutoff that you put in into this workflow as well. And you can also differentiate those. So that's kind of what we did in Phoenix. We differentiated based off of the demand points with kind of running on the assumption that those folks who are experiencing homelessness might not be able to travel as far as some of those that are in a kind of like a fixed home or a sheltered home. So yeah, you can reflect the differences in terms of your cutoff value based off of the type of demand point, as an example there. And another thing you have to do is set up and say how many facilities you want to locate. So in Phoenix, we wanted to identify 10 new locations and we had 113 that were existing. So in that parameter, we put 123 for the total number of facilities. And then the last part is an important piece to note too, and this is the problem type. So when I say problem type, when it's going through and solving this, before I mentioned maximize coverage as like one of the problem types. So that's just to say it's going to do this in such a way where it aims to maximize the coverage or basically maximize the number of those demand points that can be within, say, a mile or a set distance of a cooling center. So that's really what I'm talking about when I'm saying maximize coverage there. There are a variety of different types of those. There's ones where you can also consider the capacity of the locations as well. We haven't really explored that option quite yet, but it is something that we could incorporate as well. And a lot of the prior research with cooling center optimization using similar methods have also kind of leaned into the maximized coverage approach. So it seems to kind of be the norm at this point. All right, so I just have like a few more slides left, and I just wanted to showcase some of the kind of output. So that's another figure from the paper. And this is really just showing some of the output for Phoenix and Tucson. So we have the existing cooling centers in the darker blue, and hydration centers for Tucson in the lighter blue. And then the white diamonds indicate what were our candidate locations. These were actually the ones that were from the candidate locations set that were selected. So you can kind of see, like, obviously, if this was more of an interactive graphic, we could think about like where those locations are relative to existing ones. But it kind of gives you an idea of like what some of this output could look like. So that's kind of what we've been doing with the paper. I will also add to, in addition to that, I've also been kind of producing some of these maps. I did this more last summer, but this builds on the same approach. So it's using the same kind of optimization approach that we developed and published on in that prior paper. The only difference is this kind of been updated for a particular point in time. And I wanted to just show, you can see like the full map a bit better here. And then this kind of like inset map here is just going to be like a specific subset of the area. So the polygons are just these like 1 mile buffers, and that's really to kind of visualize like this is the service area associated with any given cooling center. And then within the zoomed one, you can kind of see that the existing cooling center that's over there is in green. We have some candidate locations as well as the existing demand ones. Yeah, so that, I know it was kind of a lot of information, but I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the approach, the workflow, and yeah, I will go ahead and hand it on off to Erica.
Thanks, Lance. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen if that's okay.
Cool.
Great. Okay, I just wanted to make a note that I'm just one person on the University of Arizona Brace team. There are many people that have worked, including lots of interns in the past. And so over here on the left side, you can see the core support, which is Heidi Brown and Lad Keith, and me as well. I was a staff member, now faculty. And we also had quite a few interns who worked on this project over time, specifically Kurt, who is not highlighted, but he worked with us about 4 years ago and was really instrumental in making sure that we could translate what was being done in Maricopa with Lance's team down in Pima County. And this project actually came out of some conversations with our stakeholders at the Pima County Health Department. So Joe Tabor was our kind of original contact when this last round of Brace started, and he was really interested in where new cooling center locations could happen. I don't know if you all remember, but there were lots of other things going on in 2020. And so health department staff were very much taxed. And so we were able to support them with the mapping side of things. So in 2022, that the Pima County Health Department and Pima Association of Governments, there was really only about 10 cooling centers that were active and for small amounts of time during the day. And so expanding the cooling center network was a priority for the health department, and to be able to identify where new locations should be placed. So I just wanted to make a note that it really did come out of our health department partners and their needs and the asks that they had. And so what I'm going to do is kind of show you the application of the tool and what we've done to kind of make it easy and allow people to access the tool and some of the ways that we've been able to use it. So Lance shared that one of the last figures, which I'll bring up again, if I can find it. This is kind of our figure 2. And if you focus on the right-hand side, this was what we were able to give back. So at the end of the network analyst tool, there's an attribute table that you can open up in ArcGIS, and it can tell you exact locations and addresses for where those new cooling center locations can be. What we did, we had an intern go and say, here's 25 candidate locations that you could choose from. We gave that list back to Joe and said, here's their contact information. Here's what we could find publicly available online, and for who the contact for that facility is. He called them up, or people on his team called them up, and 3 of the cooling centers actually enrolled for the next year of the cooling center program. So there is actual, this was a project that Lance led, and it was a great way for us to use ArcGIS, but it actually ended up expanding the cooling center network too, which I think is really great and important thing to highlight here. The other thing I wanted to share is that I don't know if you've worked in ArcGIS before, but I find it extremely difficult. And so depending on how much prior training you've had, and how comfortable you are with the tool, it can be fairly difficult to figure out where you need to click. You can mess it up very quickly. And so what we've done is created a protocol that is a click step-by-step process with all of the links to the data layers that we used here, the input layers, as well as some of the motivations and the reasons for why we chose these things. Lance did a great job talking about why we chose these specific information, but you can also see some of the reasons why we chose that in here. These are all choices that you can make, and it's a very flexible tool. So just because we did something our way doesn't mean that it's necessarily right for your jurisdiction. Things that were done in Maricopa weren't right for Pima. And so I want to make a note that it's just really flexible in general. So it really does go through loading all of the layers, identifying where to click, and highlights, the screens that you need to go through, even down to, when you get into the subscreens of the subscreens, and even, what you need to input into those different areas. Even to make this even a little bit easier, because I know it's difficult to keep track of things in PDFs, which we're happy to share that. We also created a GitHub. So the GitHub has a PDF with all of those steps. There's information, there's a link to the paper. There's some more information about the project and who is on the team, how to get started, and as well as the tutorial. So each of those, that PDF that I was just showing with all of the steps. What we do with this, what we've done with the optimization protocol so far, is teach this in Heidi Brown's spatial epi class. And so we've done this 2 times so far, so 2 rounds. And what the students get the opportunity to do is work through that protocol and develop a map that they would then give to the health department and say these were the candidate locations that they should be. This last time that we taught the class, the students were actually working on a mosquito project with Pima County Health Department again. And so they had a need to identify where new trap locations should be located. So I know we're talking about heat today, but in the summer, we also see an increase in mosquitoes, especially when we start getting those summer rains. And so that they also were able to apply the network analyst tool to identify new trap locations that the county government could then place if they needed to around Tucson. So I know that there's lots of applications at the health department that this tool could potentially be useful for. And so I wanted to plug that, just keep that in mind. If you have some other opportunities to use this tool, it's not just good for heat, it's good for other hazards as well. And then the last thing I just wanted to share is from the Arizona team is the website. If you go to heat.arizona.edu, there's lots of resources. LAD's team leads that. There's lots of things available, links to papers that are published, news, updates, and a newsletter that you can actually sign up for as well, which I think is really great in seeing what other things are going on, including things like this webinar, but other work groups and committees that are happening around the state and around the country. And I think with that, that's all I had. That's all I wanted to share. So I think we can open it up to Q&A if anyone had any questions, or Lance, if you had any other things that you wanted to share about the project.
I think we can open up the questions. The only other thing in general that I'm working on related to this too is I am trying to think of or develop an open source kind of web dashboard version of this, with the idea of it being easier to use. But that's it's still a work in progress. So yeah, any questions?
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. We were just absolutely excited to hear you guys both present. And Lance, it's great to see you again. So quick question. So Megan Batchelor's right here next to me. And I think I recall, Lance, that what you used to put your vulnerable populations in was the HMIS data. Is that accurate? The people experiencing homelessness, I think it was the homeless encampments from HMIS, or was it from the point in time?
So yeah, so that one was from the point in time data that we actually got from Clio and several others a while back. But we also have, and like that was specifically for the paper. What I've done a little bit more recently, that last map that I showed, I've been able to use the point in time data, but also the data set, I forget the name of it, but the one where it's collected throughout the year. So I can kind of like narrow into like the summer months, and it's not just that one point in time. But yeah, those were the data that we have used there.
Okay, so you mentioned you were going to maybe put up a dashboard. What are you thinking about on a timeline for that? And if it's not super soon, would you be willing to share components so that others could replicate not exactly what you're doing, but maybe even tweak it a little bit, particularly, and we talked to you about this last time we met.
Mm-hmm.
The one piece that we would love to just be able to optimize where to put a cooling center without being worried about whether there's a building there at all, an eligible building. So we'd almost take out that layer. That's kind of what we had in mind. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as far as the dashboard thing goes, so I've basically been able to kind of like replicate the process of like actually doing the location modeling in R. So the next step is like trying to create the dashboard process of that. So that's not something that I have like timeline wise is going to be like done this summer. I'm really thinking of that as hopefully being able to kind of like be tested and done toward the end of the summer with the eye toward being more useful as we all prepare for the next heat season. That being said, the GitHub site that Erika showed and the kind of workflow that we have here is something that can be replicated in ArcGIS. One of the reasons I wanted to kind of shift to an more open source thing was just because ArcGIS is a software that requires license and it's expensive. Everybody can necessarily afford that, but also it like. And Erika mentioned this too. You do have to have some kind of experience with GIS, right, to really be able to like get the ball running with the current approach. And I think everything that like team has done to try to like really walk people through the steps hopefully makes that approach a little bit more accessible. But yeah, that's kind of, I would say you'd be able to take the ArcGIS approach and kind of adjust it now. And if you or really anybody else is wanting to try that and running into questions or specific questions, like we can meet up as well and kind of like talk about like the specific questions related to like your specific city or something like that. Does that help?
That is perfect. We were hoping that it would be okay to play around with it, and then I was secretly hoping you'd put your contact information in the chat that we could call you if we had questions.
And hey,
Yeah.
Rebecca and Lance, if I could also piggyback there, with the questions around the future of Brace and so forth, I think there is a big opportunity to think about kind of the future home and owner of this this work. And if anybody is sitting on the phone with or joining the call with a big checkbook and wants to fund this type of work, I think there's that opportunity on the table as well. I mean, I think Lance and Erika both sort of done a really good job pushing forward this on their own with their teams. But boy, there are certainly orders of magnitude of possibility in the future that we've really just begun to scratch the surface on. And Rebecca, I love thinking about your scenario. You can kind of click the scenario you'd like to play with. You want to work on existing buildings, only type of buildings, no buildings at all, to just pick a random point that's most optimal. And so how do you code in those different scenarios into a user-friendly interface? I think is work of a lot of people who are a lot more skilled than I am, for sure. But yeah, let's keep that dialogue going.
I did want to say that one of the locations in Pima County, at least that was selected, one of the parcels was in South Tucson. And that location actually wasn't available, but for this last year, but a mobile cooling center location was actually able to be placed in South Tucson this past year. And it was a successful cooling center location that people visited. And so I think maybe a workaround, instead of looking at the parcel data, is you could do the parcel centroid, or you could look at, if you're census tract or smaller centroid, which ones are the ones that are most specific, and use those for your point locations instead. So I think that there's lots of ways to do it, not needing to get to that finer resolution of actual physical buildings if that wasn't of interest.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna, Cleo, just a second. I'm gonna go to Lad real quick and then I'll come back to you if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I'll keep this pretty quick. The only thing I wanted to add is after this project, it kind of sharing the results around Tucson and Pima County inspired another project that Eric and I could present later on down the road, but a paper that's going under review soon, where we took kind of a similar analysis of the cooling center locations and did a walk shed analysis to see how far people could walk and kind of the accessibility by walking, and kind of looked at sidewalk access and all of that, and then also looked at transit access and kind of the number of bus stops that it would take to get to cooling centers, and kind of was able to splice out how much the population was able to reach cooling centers based on kind of their transit access or their ability to walk, in short distances. So, and that sparked some really interesting conversations with our local bus authority and kind of the streetcar authority, and not only for them to kind of think about future routes and kind of operation times, but they certainly have a vested interest in wanting folks to get to the cooling centers, obviously, and not use the buses themselves as the cooling centers. And so I think that they're really interested to see kind of that analysis, and actually Tucson for the most part, I think Erica, right? We found that if you consider just one stop, most of the population has access to a cooling center. And then there's a small sliver that would require two stops. And so that kind of opened up some questions about prioritizing cooling centers for those that really took kind of a couple of transfers for them to get around to the cooling centers. So just wanted to throw that out there, something that will be coming from our team in a little bit.
Thank you, Lad. Leo, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And Lance, awesome to see you again. So glad you're still presenting things to us over here. Sorry if I missed this. The vulnerable population point, is that just those experiencing homelessness, or is there like age data in there as well, or and like income data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for currently at this point, it's just the point themselves as far as like the location of those individuals experiencing homelessness.
Okay.
Because a lot of this is this big like location modeling approach, right? So it really is like where these demand points start is really important as well as far as how this approach is lined out. That being said, there are definitely other ways to kind of incorporate other information. I mentioned before how when we were looking at like the heat vulnerability index, we did kind of start with that little layer of information. But one thing I like about this is we can like incorporate that bit of information and then hopefully tie together some other more useful information, kind of thinking of the age and stuff like that as well, that you just mentioned. But yeah, largely it was just kind of focusing on the points themselves.
Okay, because yeah, I was thinking too, like beyond those experiencing homelessness, given like just particularly like indoor deaths with those over certain ages, like them being a super vulnerable population as well, and how this could be applied to that type of vulnerability as well. So I couldn't remember if that all was incorporated in this or it was really just using the homelessness data. Secondary question, if you like, is there any piece of data that you really wanted for this or that you felt like would take this to an additional level that you weren't able to get, or like we just simply don't have? Or would you say this project is like, for the time being, mostly like you had everything you wanted and it was like complete in that sense?
Yeah, and so for where this project was, I think we kind of had like, I mean, the fact that we had the data for those experiencing unsheltered homelessness and just the spatial data was more than a lot of people have. So like that in of itself was super helpful. But and kind of relating to your prior question too, I think there is still this question of like, how do we better differentiate? Because I mean, even just thinking of, those folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, in addition to those who may, have like a roof over their head, but they still struggle to, be able to run their AC when they need to. Like heat's still a problem, and they still have these kind of compounding factors that make like adaptation difficult. So in my mind, the idea is like, is there a way to bring this information together to kind of get a more, for lack of a better word, I guess, like precise kind of estimate of where we might want to put these. So far, I've been combining a lot of the information through just a weighting of the actual demand points themselves. And so I think there's room to explore there as far as like other information and other data as well. Because one thing we also don't have in this process right now, which is kind of funny to say out loud, but we don't have temperature data set represented in terms of like representing like exposure. And that could, and we've thought about different ways to bring it in. And I think part of the difficulty there is that like some of the more like readily accessible temperature data sets, like some of the air temperature data sets, some of the land surface temperature data sets aren't really the right scale for this type of problem, right? In terms of like the kind of like spatial resolution of that data. But yeah, there's definitely I think ways to think about refining this approach. I know another one that Aaron's mentioned before in other calls is like incorporating walkability data as well. And so that's another kind of layer to consider too. So yeah, I think there's definitely avenues to bring in other data sets to kind of enhance this. But as far as like what would be like the top 3 data sets I wish I had right now, I don't have the answer to that.
No, that
Hey,
was
Lance.
good response. Thank you. I was just curious.
Yeah.
I will
Hey,
say
Lance,
for the Tucson metro area, we did not have point in time data. So that was something that we would have really appreciated being able to use. It just wasn't available when we were doing the analysis. And I also wanted to shout out Sam Chambers, who is another spatial analyst on our U of A team. He worked on something called body heat storage, which we would have, now that we have that, would like to be able to combine that with the cooling center location data. And as part of that safe walk shed paper that Lad was talking about, we kind of hope to incorporate those 2 data sets to determine if the new cooling center locations are actually within a safe heat walk shed, or if they're within bounds where it would make it too hot for someone to have to be able to transport or to have to go to.
Great, Dave.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on Lance and give a shout out to Patricia and the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience team at ASU. I know, a lot of work to identify spatially where mobile and manufactured home communities are. We felt like that was a pretty big value add, and we also know there's still a lot of work to do on that front. So Cleo, I think that's a data frontier. And then Lance briefly alluded to it in his remarks, but the algorithm doesn't really understand the real nature of these facilities right now. Lance alluded to the fact that right now we don't have facility specific capacity built in, nor do we have anything about the actual dynamics of these facilities. Some of the facilities, as we know and have learned over the past few years together, are already at their capacity a lot of the time, whereas others have a lot of capacity, and the algorithm doesn't really understand that right now. We don't feed anything in about it. Time of day patterns, time of week or day of week patterns, all that could be contemplated in a next generation upscaling of this.